This is ACC Nation. That's Will Ojanen, and I'm Jim Quist. Our special guest played for the Virginia Cavaliers and was their captain in his final year. He was an assistant and then head coach of the Virginia women's basketball team. He's a college basketball analyst, and you've seen him on CBS, ESPN, Fox, Raycom, and the ACC network. I'm sure I've missed something in there. He's been a familiar face in the coverage of the NCAA men's tournament year after year after year, and has done play-by-play in baseball's Carolina League, women's college basketball, soccer, and ACC baseball. We welcome Dan Bonner to the show. Dan, thank you for joining us.
Well, Jim, Will, thank you very much for the invitation.
That's quite a resume, to say the least. It's a lot of sports, a lot of action.
Well, I think the main thing you have to say about that resume is it indicates you're talking to an old guy.
No.
So, you can't do that in a very short period of time, so that's over a very, very long time.
Well, we'll say you can't do it in a short period of time, but we don't buy the old guy part of it. So, hey, Dan, with the season nearing, it's time to cold crash all of the relevant information on teams. Now, I want to know this because I've never had to do this sort of thing. I've only done things like, play-by-play on high school basketball, and it was a singular team. So that was pretty easy. But man, talking about all the information you have to download into your brain season to season to season boggles me just a bit. Explain that process for us, would you?
Well, it's like any other process. I think you have to break it down into parts to make it manageable. And one of the things, in fact, Seth Greenberg and I were having a conversation a few years ago, and he wanted to know, it was before the season started, and he wanted to know, he said, well, have you seen Virginia Tech practice? And I said, well, no. And he said, have you seen Virginia practice? And I said, well, no. And he went down a list of teams, and I hadn't seen anybody practice. And he said, well, how can you do your job? I said, Seth, my job isn't the same as your job. Your job is being in the studio. You have to know all the teams. The teams that I have to know are the teams that I have sitting there in the game right in front of me. And so I try to, at this time of the year, in fact, all summer long, I try to keep myself up to date, reading everything I can about the various teams. I don't really get into who's recruiting whom and that kind of stuff because I'm never worried about that. Let's get the guys out there. Let's turn the lights on. Let's put the uniforms on. Let's see what happens. So at this point in the year, I'm just sort of general information. Now, my first game is November the 6th. I have Radford playing at North Carolina. And so I've started to dig more deeply into those teams. So I don't really have to know everything there is to know about Tennessee and Duke and Kansas at this time of the year. I have general information about all those teams up here in my head with what little room there's still left there. But so it's not really as daunting as it seems. I don't have to know everything all at once. I have the whole year to figure it out.
That fills in the blanks for me perfectly. I want to get your impression, Dan, on something. How much the transfer portal and the NIL programs have begun to even out the playing field in NCAA basketball, or has it?
Jim, I think we're still early in the transfer portal / NIL era. I think things are shaking out. I think that the teams that were good before are still good. I think that you have the possibility of teams becoming very good very quickly using the transfer portal. Wake Forest with Steve Forbes over the last couple of years is a perfect example. They completely redo their team with the transfer portal every year. But he's used to that. He was a junior college coach, and that's what you do. So I think that it hasn't really evened things out team-wise as much as the biggest impact that I've seen so far is that big men, 7-foot guys, who are sort of out of fashion in the NBA at the moment, given NIL, they're staying in college longer. So that's how you have Hunter Dickinson, through the transfer portal. He's at Kansas, and Armando Bacot is still at North Carolina, and Zach Edey is still at Purdue, and not this year, but last year, Drew Timme stayed at Gonzaga. So I just think that there are certain types of players, the big men right at the moment, who, given the financial opportunities presented by the NIL, are a little bit more likely to stay in college than they would have before.
It surprises me that the big guys are kind of out of fashion in the NBA, but I see the type of play that's going on and I understand it, but nonetheless, boy, you hit on some big names there, and that tells me an awful lot about why they're staying on, because I've often wondered what exactly is it that's keeping them around. Because I know it's not the NIL programs per se, but certainly there's a lot of opportunity there for them. So thanks for going over that with us. Will, I'm going to let you go ahead and start off, and we'll take a look at some of these top 25 teams and see what's going on.
Yeah, definitely. And this is a very fascinating year. Being we are ACC nation, I'm going to start in the ACC with the team that many people think have a real shot of winning a national championship this year, and that is Duke. With their stellar recruiting class, they've got really good guards. Do you think this is the year Duke can potentially win it all?
Well, I think so. I think Duke is one of those programs that every year you have to consider that they're going to at least contend. And Will, I think you hit on a really good point. They had a stellar recruiting class, but they also have really talented veteran players back. Kyle Filipowski is a guy everybody thought would go to the NBA. And I thought it was really interesting that he elected to have surgery and come back to college to sort of hone his game a little bit. And so you have Kyle Filipowski, you got Jeremy Roach, you got Tyrese Proctor. So you have a really good core of guys around which to build. And when they're these outstanding freshmen, if they play up to potential, and generally they do at Duke, then yeah, I think Duke is going to be potentially one of the top teams in the country. And you look at the preseason polls, and everybody sort of agrees with that. They're in the top 10 everywhere.
And staying in the ACC with some top-rated teams, Miami's a team I'm kind of intrigued by from the standpoint of, yeah, they're highly ranked again. They've made a couple big March runs, but my concern with them is I feel like Isaiah Wong meant so much to that team, and I think they're going to really miss him this year. What are your thoughts on Miami?
Well, I think obviously when you have a program in like Miami, guys are going to graduate, guys are going to leave. And it's not only Isaiah Wong. I thought Jordan Miller was one of the keys to their team, and he's also gone. But, we talk about transfers. Matthew Cleveland, who was one of the best players in the ACC at Florida State, transferred in. And they still have Norchad Omier, and they still have Nigel Pack. They are a team, I think, that can be very good. I think that they will improve as the season goes on, because that's the way Jim Larrañaga team always do. But they're a team, they have no margin for error. They can't afford any injuries, particularly to key players. If Omier gets hurt or Pack gets hurt for any length of time, then I think that really throws a monkey wrench into what Miami can do.
You mentioned your first game of the season is going to be North Carolina, and let's talk about them real quick, because again, they're a team that's really reshaped the roster through the portal, and you can argue Caleb Love could be addition by subtraction. But then again, outside of the run they made in the tournament, they haven't been a great team. Sell me on Hubert Davis and what this Carolina team can do this year.
I think that this is going to be a really good North Carolina team. I think, they have the Davis kid back, KJ Davis, obviously Armando Bacot. And what you have to do, and I think Hubert embraces this, you have one of the best inside players in the country, and he's a traditional inside player. So you have to figure out a way to build around him. They are a team. There's nothing wrong with three-point shots. That's the basis of college basketball now. But you get your three-point shots if you're a team like North Carolina playing inside out. And so last year, it just wasn't – there were a lot of expectations for North Carolina. The pieces just didn't fit really together very well. They had some tough breaks. I think Hubert Davis is a really good coach. I think that he is in a very tough situation. talk about a tough act to follow. Of course, anybody you follow at North Carolina is going to be a tough act to follow. And I think that, he's a guy, he's learning. He's been there a couple of years now. I think the players like him. He likes the players. I expect North Carolina is going to have a much better year this year than they did last year, at least with regards to expectations. The bar was very high for them last year, and they don't have that problem this year.
Yeah.
So there's nobody else in the top 25 of either the USA Today or Virginia, or rather AP. I'm giving away who I'm getting ready to talk about, the AP top 25. But Virginia is in that receiving votes category, and they're just outside of both top 25s. One at 31, I believe, in the AP, and 33 in the USA Today coaches poll. Give us your thoughts on what Tony Bennett is bringing here, because it's felt as if, okay, things have slid just a little bit the last year or two. However, anytime there's quiet, and that's the way I feel right now. It seems like that still water runs deep in Charlottesville.
Well, Jim, let me tell you something. Last year, and people forget this, last year Virginia shared the ACC regular season championship. Mm-hmm. People talked about, they had a bad year last year. They won the ACC regular season championship. There was a time when if a Virginia team won the ACC regular season championship, they'd have had a parade. They'd have had 10 parades. And so, I mean, Virginia has won or shared 6 of the last 10 ACC regular season championships. So I don't think there's anything wrong in Charlottesville. Virginia, like I said about Miami, they're a team, they don't have a lot of margin for error. I think that in Reese Beekman, they have one of the conference's top players. What is he, top 5? Is he top 10? I don't know. But he's one of the conference's best players. He's also a very experienced guy. In Ryan Dunn, they have a guy who a lot of people think has a chance to take a great leap forward. Isaac McNeely showed a little bit last year that he can be a very good shooter. The kid from Merrimack, whose name escapes me right at the moment, transfer.
Minor.
There you go. The guy coming in from the transfer portal he's somebody who's going to be key because Virginia is always at their best when they have a big guy who can get out and defend a little bit on the perimeter. That's very important as they work against screens in that defense, and who can make outside shots and open thing up in the middle. I think this is a Virginia team that has a lot of potential. And I'll just leave it at that. I think the reason that they are receiving votes is simply people who are doing the voting respect a great deal what Tony Bennett has done. I'm not sure that this is a Virginia team based on what they have that's deserving of those votes at this point, but I certainly think this is a Virginia team that has a chance to be very deserving of votes as the year goes on.
Dan, anytime I have an opportunity to have 2 Virginia fans on at the same time, I'm going to give a little bit of grief to any Wahoos. And I don't get very far with it because my wife is a UVA grad. So if I give you too much, I end up hearing it later. So,
well, good. You should.
I figured
I like your wife already.
Yeah. But me, well, whatever. Let's something that I was reading just today that Virginia and UConn had a little bit of a secret scrimmage there, and Dan Hurley liked what he saw for his guys, but I haven't heard anything from Tony Bennett. Not that means anything one way or the other, but let's get back into this top 25 here. We'll talk a little bit about UConn here in just a moment, but let's talk about Kansas and what they're bringing to the table this year. This is a team that just, for all intents and purposes, just seems so loaded.
Well, they are, and Kansas usually is. I think the big thing for them, to my mind, is the fact that Hunter Dickinson decided to go there. That makes anybody a contender if that kid is on your team. But the Jalen Wilson kid, He's not there anymore, and Grady Dick is not there anymore. And those are two big pieces that they have to fill. And so when you get, and the same thing applies to UConn, Adama Sanogo isn't there anymore. And they have, so you can't just say, okay, they had a good year last year, they have 3 starters back, or they had a great year last year and they have 4 guys back, because you have to put together a new team every year. I like UConn. I had them a couple times in the NCAA tournament. I was really impressed with the way they played. I've had Kansas many times over the years in the NCAA tournament, and they just keep bringing talent in. And so it'll be really interesting. I think the consensus about Kansas is generally everybody thinks they're the best team in the country. Purdue is right up there as well. Purdue, now, of course, they have everybody back. And so that'll be interesting, because even when you have everybody back, it's different as you try to build a new team. Marquette everybody thinks they're going to have a really good year. Michigan State had a real good recruiting class, and a lot of people think they're in the top 5. So the interesting thing is, if you look at you look at the Final Four last year, you had Florida Atlantic and San Diego State. And Florida Atlantic in particular, not a traditional power. San Diego State, a traditional power out on the West Coast, but they're not in a power conference. And here, those 2 teams are in the Final Four. But you look at the preseason polls, and who do you see? You see the Big Ten, you see the Big 12, you see the Big East, you see the SEC. And so it's like the revenge of the power schools, at least here, to start the season. And Florida Atlantic, of course, based on their year last year, they're not in the top 10, but they're in the top 25. So again, it's so early in the year. People are going to disappoint. People are they're going to play better than you think. People are going to get hurt. But the wonderful thing about this time of the year is nobody's lost any games yet. Everybody is still optimistic, and I think that it's just very interesting as you get ready.
One of the things I love about watching your analysis and talking with you, Dan, is that you convey the wisdom of a coach. And if people have not picked up on this over the years, or even in just the last minute of you speaking, it should be noted that you're realistic about things and talking about how a team, even though you may bring back 3 or 4 starters, doesn't mean anything. It's a new season. Everything starts over. It is important, but it doesn't automatically, or shouldn't not automatically, put you someplace that you shouldn't deserve to be. Let's talk a little bit about some of these teams that are getting a lot of love. We talked a little bit about Duke, but Tennessee, and you mentioned Florida Atlantic. These teams, in the eyes of the people who are doing the polling, are 2 teams that have moved up a lot in the preseason poll. Sometimes preseason polls, for me, I just tend to toss them out because it's water cooler talk to me. But until they start playing, I don't know what to think. But Tennessee and Florida Atlantic, I think, are 2 teams that we should talk a little bit about. Give us a little feel there.
Well, Florida Atlantic has basically everybody back. The most impressive thing to me about Florida Atlantic is they didn't really lose people to the transfer portal. Normally that would happen. And I had Tennessee in the NCAA tournament last year, and I was extremely impressed with their toughness. I mean, good heavens, it was like everybody talked about how they're trying to make college basketball less physical. Well, nobody told Tennessee. So they, of course, they've got that Vescovi guy is one of the better, he'll be one of the better players in college basketball. But again, both of those teams are talented, and they have size, they have the ability to score. And I think that's in college basketball, that's really important. You have to be able to put the ball in the basket. Nolan Richardson told me years ago that basketball is a pretty simple game, that the only stat that means anything in a basketball game is the score. And if you score more than the other team, then you win the game. And I had a conversation with the late Paul Hatcher, who was the winningest high school coach in Virginia history, who coached here in Stanton. And he once said to me, Dan, if you hold the other team to 40, you only have to get 41 to win. And I said, well, that's true, Paul. But if you scored 90, they got to get 91 to beat you. And I think it's hard for people to get 91. And so Florida Atlantic is one of those teams. They might get 91 to beat you. In Tennessee, they might only need 41 to beat you.
I'm glad you brought up Coach Hatcher. He was quite the character. Now, on the other side of this, teams that are slipping, at least in the eyes of some of the coaches and the writers, Houston, Arizona, Texas, Baylor, St. Mary's, and especially Alabama. Boy, they really took a knock in this preseason poll, sliding way down from where they were initially. What's this a reflection of?
Well, I don't know that it's a reflection of anything in particular. St. Mary's, if I read correctly, in the West Coast Conference, the media and the coaches in the West Coast Conference, they picked them over Gonzaga to win the conference. And so that means, people, maybe not on the national scene, but if you're better than Gonzaga in the West Coast Conference, to my mind, that makes you pretty good.
Yeah.
Alabama. Now they're going to try to beat you scoring 100 points, and so that's not necessarily a popular way to go. But I think Alabama is going to be really good. I think the SEC is loaded. Arkansas, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi State, and Kentucky. They're going to be pretty good. They're back to their old ways. They've got all kinds of freshmen, much more so than the transfer portal. They went the freshman route. And Houston, as I look at these polls, I still see Houston, they're up there in the top 15. And so the way they play, we talked about each team being different, but you have coaches like to talk about their culture. And it's a very hard-nosed culture at Houston. You go there, you know what's expected of you. And I expect they're going to be pretty good. Now, they're in the Big 12 this year, aren't they?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. All right. Well, that'll make it a little harder for them. So.
Yeah. There's a lot of competition coming into the Big 12. It is absolutely going to be a loaded basketball conference, which is great. More entertainment for the rest of us. Quick question before I hand it off to Will. You brought up Kentucky, and we've talked about Duke. Mike is gone from Duke. Calipari is still at Kentucky. That one and done seems to have kind of fallen out of favor to some degree, but maybe still there on and off. I don't know what to think there. Are we at that point where one and done is no longer the thing, or is it just going to kind of come and go?
I think one and done is still a thing. Yeah, I mean, Duke last year, they had two guys who were one and done. And so the difference is the one and dones are not the Zach Edey's. I said that big guys are out of favor in the NBA. Well, they're really not. The big guys who are in favor in the NBA are guys like Kevin Durant, who are 7 feet tall and can do anything. Well, there are not many guys like that around. So, but I think the one and done still exists. I think, though, that the players are a little bit smarter about things in terms of the kid from Syracuse, Judah Mintz. Everybody thought that he was going to be one and done. But he put his name in for the NBA draft, and he took it out when the word that he got was that he was going to be a second-round draft pick. Well, in this day and age, in the age of NIL, you can make money while you're in college. You don't have to take the risk of going to the NBA and being a second-round draft pick. If you're a first-round draft pick and you get guaranteed money, then off you go. So I think that one and done is still there. I don't think it is the major story that it was. But I think it's still there, and the best players are going to stay in college a year and then go to the NBA.
Well,
I'm going to circle back to the ACC real quick. I'm going to go talk about a couple of teams. Let me start with Clemson. This is a team that the record was worthy of being in the NCAA tournament, but some of the losses were just very head-scratching, especially losing to Louisville, which... well, that was a disaster. But can Clemson rebound and get into the tournament this year? I feel like this is a pivotal year for Brad Brownell.
The poor Brad Brownell, I mean, he's had as much success at Clemson as anybody's ever had. And every year is a pivotal year for him. He's a really good coach and he's a really good guy. And they should have an excellent team this year. I mean, Hunter Tyson is gone, but PJ Hall is back. And PJ Hall is one of the most underrated big players in the country. I think he can have an all ACC kind of year. I think they have nice pieces to build around him. But guys, everybody in the ACC, any of the teams in the ACC, what's going to determine how many teams get in the NCAA tournament? What's going to determine whether we're talking about, oh, it's a down year for the ACC, is how all of these teams perform in the non-conference portion of the schedule. That is what has killed the ACC in the last couple of years, because we're in the era of the net, the NCAA evaluation tool. And your own net is not nearly as important as the net of your opponents. And so what you have to do, not only you, but every team in your conference, and this is why the Big Ten and the Big 12 and the Big East, everybody talks about what great leagues they've been the last couple of years, because they've done this. Not only do you have to win every single game you're supposed to win, and then win a representative sample of the games that are sort of even games, everybody else in your conference has to do the same thing. Last year, when conference play started, and think about this, when conference play started last year, every single team in the Big 12, and I know last year there was the Big 12, but there were only 10 teams, but every single team in the Big 12 had a net of 60 or better. And what that meant was that almost any time you played a Big 12 opponent, you were getting an opportunity for a quad one win. And so people talked about, well, Kansas's resume, they're 10-1 in quad one games. Well, fine. The key there is they had 11. In the ACC last year, now, is it easier to win a game at home or on the road? Well, obviously it's easier to win at home. But in the quad system, if you're going to get a quad one win at home, you have to beat a team whose net is between 1 and 30. And in the ACC last year, there was only one team like that, and that was Duke. So that means when you played anybody else at home, you could not get a quad one win. It was not a quad one game. And so I think Clemson has a chance to have a really good year. I think Pittsburgh has some interesting possibilities. I think North Carolina State has some interesting possibilities, but none of that makes any difference unless every team in the ACC performs well in the non-conference portion of the schedule. You can't have any 300 net teams in your league. That just kills you.
100% right on that, Dan. And just to add, Clemson definitely learned their lesson with some of the teams they've scheduled in non-conference, like Alabama, TCU, and Memphis, for example. That hopefully they can get a game or two, and that will definitely propel them into the tournament. But how weird is it going to be looking over to the Syracuse sidelines and not seeing Jim Boeheim?
Well, it's going to be different. Jim Boeheim. I'll tell you how long Jim Boeheim's been at Syracuse. He was the assistant coach who was responsible for showing me around when I made my visit to Syracuse.
Wow.
So obviously, that was in 1873. And so he's been there a long time. That's going to be very different. He was a certain type of coach. He ran his program a certain type of way. And now, even though Adrian Autry, who has been with Jim Boeheim for years, he's going to be a different kind of coach. He's going to run the program a different way. And so I just think that's going to be a really interesting transition there. I wonder if Syracuse, though, has the talent at this point to really be competitive in the ACC. Losing Joe Girard didn't help them. Getting Judah Mintz back did, but losing Joe Girard didn't help them. Benny Williams has been a guy who people have talked about how he's going to blossom, and he has yet to do it at Syracuse. If he does, then that really helps them out. But I think it's going to be an interesting year for Adrian Autry. I'm not saying Syracuse isn't going to have any success. I think that but I think it's going to be a struggle for Syracuse, and not because of the coach. I think just because I think maybe their talent level is a little bit less than they would prefer.
I think personally the best hire amongst ACC schools was David Stoudemire to Georgia Tech. Now, I don't think they're going to be a whole lot this year, but just seeing what he's done at his past stop before going to the NBA, that he is somebody that really knows the game and can coach. You think he's going to work out at Georgia Tech?
Whether anybody works out or not depends mainly on what kind of players they can get. If he can get players, yes, it'll work out at Georgia Tech. I mean, they've been able to get players at Georgia Tech in the past. Bobby Cremins obviously got great players. Paul Hewitt was able to get some great players. So if you get really good players, then you can be a really good coach. And I think that's the challenge for Damon Stoudemire. Yeah, I think he's got the potential to be really good. It's the same challenge that Micah Shrewsbury is facing at Notre Dame. Micah Shrewsbury showed at Penn State that he's a very good coach, but Notre Dame is sort of a different kind of situation. I think the cupboard is a little bit bare out there. And so can he be successful? Yes. How quickly can it be successful? I don't know. Most schools are not patient. The University of Pittsburgh deserves a lot of credit because they didn't, they could have dumped Jeff Capel and they didn't. And so Jeff Capel's, their patience was rewarded last year. Pitt had a really good year. I think Pitt has a chance to have a really good year again, but it's a combination. If your athletic director believes in you, if the athletic director can hold off the boosters who think that everybody ought to win the national championship every year, then I think you have a chance to build a program. And will Damon Stoudemire get that? I don't know. Will Micah Shrewsbury get that? I don't know.
Aren't teams supposed to win the national championship every year, Dan? I'm confused. Quick question for you: with ACC, is there any school that you can look at and go, that's a team you better keep an eye out for?
Well, I just mentioned him. I think that team is Clemson. I think Clemson has a chance to have a really good year. And I'm not predicting they're going to win the ACC, but I mean, think about it. Last year, and this is a trivia question. Nobody would probably be able to answer this because they missed the NCAA tournament. But last year they finished third in the league. They won 14 games in the ACC. Yeah. And they didn't go to the NCAA tournament. They beat North Carolina State 3 times. And North Carolina State went to the NCAA tournament. And all that had to do with what happened in the non-conference part of the schedule and the fact that you had a team like Louisville Louisville, yeah, they had a very bad year last year, but they had some people who could play. And if you weren't playing your best game, Louisville could get you. But if you lose that game, it's a disaster. And so the ACC has to avoid that this year. They can't have any teams like that.
Now, how about NCAA wise? Is there any team that across all of the conferences, are there any teams that you would look at them and think, oh, yeah, this is who's going to sneak up on somebody this year?
I don't know that there's any sneaking up that's going to go on. I think that we talked about Tennessee, and of course, they're in a lot of the polls, they're in the top 5, so they wouldn't really be a surprise. But somebody like Villanova, for example, they're in, a lot of the polls I've seen, they're in the lower part of the top 25. But they've got some guys back from injury. That coach is settling in. This will be his second year. So I think Villanova is a team that could have a really good year, although the Big East is awfully good. But, at this point in the year, it's hard to talk about somebody going to sneak up on you because I don't really know. Nobody would have predicted Florida Atlantic last year. And so I just think, the team that you were talking about, St. Mary's, they're not in any of the polls nationally. But like I said, out on the West Coast, the writers and the coaches out there picked them to win that league. So I think they're going to have a really good year as well.
That's who we ought to be listening to overall. Hey, just totally off track here before we let you go. You've spent a lot of time on the road, and anytime somebody does that, I always like to ask them a question or two about your favorite places to eat. Because I'm sure that you've gone into a lot of different cities, a lot of, big, small, medium, and there's always got to be a favorite place that you don't mind going back to at any time when you come through.
I'm not really much of a restaurant guy. Unless I'm with my partner, and sometimes you're not. Sometimes you don't meet your partner until you actually get to you're working. I don't like to go to restaurants by myself. Usually I just order out. And so I don't know. That's a question that I would have a hard time answering. I'm just not a big culinary guy. Now, looking at me, you couldn't tell that. You think I do nothing but eat, but that's not. So I don't have an answer to that question.
Well, can I put you on the spot and ask you which one in your hometown that you like the most?
Oh, well, there's, here in Stanton, in fact, it's not in Stanton, it's in Verona. There's a really nice little Mexican restaurant. It's called Mi Rancho. That's right around the corner from where we are, or not the corner. We live out in the middle of nowhere, so it's down at the end of the road. And I think most people who come to Stanton would say that the place called the Mill Street Grill is a place where you ought to go. That's a really good restaurant. And there's a place my wife is big on hamburgers and French fries. So there's a new place that's open in Stanton called Remedy Burger, where she likes to go, and I think that's really good too. So, but the best food I get is here at home, and I don't make it.
It's always the best, especially if you don't have to make it. If somebody else is making it for you, it's all the better. Dan, thank you so much for taking some time and talking with us and sharing your thoughts, your impressions about what's coming up for the season in the NCAA and the ACC. I'll sneak one final one in here. Since you coached the women's basketball program at UVA, what do you think they're going to? Are they turning it around?
Well, they certainly had a productive year last year. And again, the whole thing involves players. And I don't really follow the women's recruiting or the transfers or anything like that. But Virginia obviously has a wonderful history of women's basketball. Nothing to do with me. My contribution to that has been woefully and greatly exaggerated over the years. The best thing I ever did was get fired so Debbie Ryan could take over. So that was my main contribution. But I think that Virginia has great facilities. They obviously have a great program, and Debbie has shown that they can recruit great players there. Just go down the list of the players who played for Debbie, and you see some of the great players in the history of the ACC. I think when they came out with the all ACC team for women, there were a bunch of Virginia players on there, people like the Burge twins and Val Ackerman and Dina Evans and Tammy Reese. And so, I mean, there have been great players at Virginia, and there's no reason why there can't be again.
Okay. I just thought I'd sneak that in there because, and a former coach, you always want to ask what their thoughts are on those sort of things. So appreciate your time. Good talking to you. It's good seeing you, and enjoy those burgers and the Mexican food just down the block. So, but more importantly, enjoy those home cooked meals because somebody else is doing it. Dan Bonner, our special guest on ACC Nation. We appreciate it, and thank you very much for joining us.
Well, Jim, thank you very much. Will, it was a pleasure. We'll talk to you guys at some point in the future, I'm sure.